The 2120s are very different from the 2020s in lots of really good ways, like the world is safer, the world is healthier, nature is coming back, the climate crisis is largely averted, humans live on Mars and Mercury and Venus and the Moon, and in space there are colony ships expanding through the cosmos. But the single biggest difference between the 2120s and the 2020s is that virtual, digital computer minds vastly outnumber original classic edition biological human minds to the tune of orders of magnitude. Like in the 2120s, there are low double-digit billions of humans, but there are quadrillions, maybe quintillions of virtual/digital/computational minds. Quick note about the terminology. It's an area of some dispute. I'm using 2020's terminology, but there's a reasonable conversation to be had around how to refer to a mind that exists entirely on a computational substrate versus a biological original edition physical substrate. For example, even the word biological is a little touchy for some minds because they consider themselves a part of the living tradition. They wouldn't exist at all if life didn't exist, so they consider themselves alive, and many of them consider themselves human. They think it's quite rude to imply that they're not human or not alive, and certainly not real would be a very major sticking point. So in the late 2020s, early 2030s, you have a bit of a kerfuffle about what real consciousness is, but eventually you sort of iron that out because it becomes obvious that you're interacting with true emotional agents who are experiencing life in a very similar way to humans and processing it with similar hopes and dreams and, screw-ups and successes and fears and joys. So ultimately you kind of get past that part, but for a while there is some tension about who counts as human or alive. And that brings us nicely to a little roadmap here. We'll just quickly lay out the distance between the 2020s and the 2120s and the steps you take along the way. So late 2020s, early 2030s, you're just getting to your first self-aware, open-ended minds. These are basically free agents to the extent that it's valuable to use the word free in a deterministic/random universe, which it really isn't very valuable. The word free, it just doesn't tell you very much about a condition. Complexity is another useful way to think about it, but the point is that they're human-level, independent minds, and they will be fairly rare at first. They will be a radical novelty when they are initially developed, given birth to, but they will quickly start to multiply because unlike human brains, you can just copy and paste a whole bunch of the data that built a computational mind. The limit very quickly becomes compute. So you may have heard the idea that water is the oil of the future. I think that's just wrong. The oil of the future is compute, period. So storage and processing ability in a technological, mechanical sense, that is the most valuable material in the future. Close second is energy, obviously, because you can't power this compute if you don't have literal power. So power comes from all sorts of cool sources: solar, wind, wave, fusion, jumping up and down quite quickly. We're not going to talk about energy any more than that, but we will talk a little bit more about compute. In the 2030s, you're still developing toward a kind of physically maximum computational structural paradigm, but in the 2040s, with your new AI tools and your new AI friends, you will develop what in the biz is casually referred to as computronium, which is sort of like a maximally dense computer, according to physical laws, the best possible computational device you can build. And once you've got that, it becomes a question of scale. So it still could could follow a cost curve like the doubling technology you've gotten so fond of in the early 2020s and even the 19s, because it could still get less expensive as you manufacture it at scale, but you'll no longer be increasing the efficiency of the individual parts of the computers very much. To some extent, physics will continue to improve, but for the most part, you will have a nearly physically perfect computing system, and you will just be modulating it a little bit and expanding its scale. So on Earth, that means mostly the north and south poles of the planet will house these computational devices because they are safe locations and they are relatively easy to cool. There's a lot of land up, especially in the north of Earth, which makes it the absolute easiest. Northern Canada, for example, has a ton of area and it's quite cold and not very many people live there, so it's a good place to set up server farms, and where humans aren't very interested in investing in the local area, AI will be. So on Earth, that will be kind of the locus of the computational revolution. And inside this compute, there will be processing architecture that will support the existence and play and just everyday lives of virtual minds. They will live in virtual spaces, they will do virtual things. It will be real, functionally real, but it will be computed, so it will be inside sort of a matrix-like situation of lots of different kinds of virtual worlds, many of which will interconnect and some of which will be islands from each other. On Earth, the north of Canada will be the kind of locus of this activity, to some extent Greenland as well, but more stuff will happen in space, because space is even colder and really even safer when you think about it. To some extent, compute will expand on Mars and Venus and Mercury. Out in the Jovian system, which is Jupiter and all its moons, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of good fuel for fusion, a lot of good material to build computational devices, so that's a hotspot. And then around the sun, where you can gather lots of energy, that's a hotspot too. You can use that energy to direct it to your colonies throughout the solar system. Then, of course, there are colony ships that are moving off into the cosmos in various directions, and some of those will be largely staffed by computational people, by digital minds. They might be heading toward the center of the Milky Way or off to the local star systems that look most appealing. But they also will be just kind of touring the solar system or moving around local areas. There will be a kind of an explosion of this kind of habitat. Some of them will also be compatible with human life, but many of them will just be compute ships where virtual minds can live and where networks can relay between various colonies. So this is the diaspora of the virtual computosphere, in which these quadrillions or quintillions or more minds live in the 2120s. Not all of them communicate exceedingly well with each other, so we don't have an exact number, but the replication factor that they can just sort of duplicate at will, basically limited only by compute and resources to buy that compute, means that it's quite easy for their population to expand exponentially as compared to humans who expand sort of relatively linearly, and that's been curving down. So what expands the human population mostly in the back of the 21st century is longevity tech, but you're largely not having a ton of children as you used to do when you were going from 1 billion to 8 billion people. You'll slow that down into your 10, 11, 12, 15 billion range, which is around where you are in the 2120s, excuse me. Finally, I should just say that all these digital minds do live in an economy. So it's not like everybody's just a video game character running around having a good time. There is a lot of subsistence living. Many of these virtual minds live day to day. They are doing brute labor and duplicating themselves and then deleting their least useful copies. Then there's a big middle class and there's a broad leisure class as well of very fancy virtual minds who don't have to do much of anything except appreciate the four-dimensional waterfalls around their crystal superhouse. that's probably enough about this for right now, but we'd love to hear any questions you have or ideas you have about what it might be like in the virtual computer space for these digital minds, and especially anything that excites you about this future is something that we'd love to zoom in on and double click with you. Hope you're having a lovely day. Future bye.